Rain hammered against the sidewalks of Vancouver as investigators pushed open the rusted freezer door. At first, nobody moved. Not because they didn't know what they were looking at, because their brains refused to process it. A human hand, vacuum-sealed flesh, a severed head with dark hair still attached. For a moment, the entire trailer went silent except for the low mechanical hum of the freezer and the distant squealing of pigs somewhere outside in the darkness. The officers had arrived at the farm searching for illegal firearms. Instead, they had just stepped into what would become the largest serial killer investigation in Canadian history. And somewhere inside the chaos of that property, among the blood-soaked clothing, butcher hooks, bone fragments, and mountains of pig manure, investigators would eventually uncover evidence tied to dozens of missing women. Women who had been disappearing for years. Women police had stopped searching for. Women society had already abandoned. Long before Robert Pickton butchered bodies inside that slaughterhouse, the city itself had already begun erasing them. Because 10 blocks away from Vancouver's glittering skyline, another world existed. Tourists never saw it. Politicians rarely entered it. And most people pretended it wasn't there at all. The downtown Eastside, a neighborhood where survival became a full-time occupation. The air smelled like rainwater, cigarette smoke, urine, gasoline, and decay. Syringes littered alleyways beside overflowing dumpsters. Men wandered the sidewalks half-conscious. Women leaned against flickering storefronts under neon lights, trying to negotiate another night they might not survive. Every corner carried desperation. Every face carried exhaustion. And predators understood something terrifying about places like this. Nobody notices when invisible people disappear. By the late 1990s, the downtown Eastside had become one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in North America. Addiction consumed entire blocks. HIV infection rates exploded. Homelessness spread faster than the city could hide it. Many of the women living there had fled violent homes, foster systems, reserves, abusive relationships, or crushing poverty. Some arrived addicted. Others became addicted after they got there. Many were indigenous women carrying generations of trauma behind exhausted eyes. Most had no safety net left. No one waiting at home. No one powerful enough to force police departments to care. And yet, the women themselves knew something was wrong long before authorities admitted it. They felt it in the streets. They whispered about it at bus stops, in alleyways, outside shelters, inside cramped single-room hotels where doors barely locked. A predator was hunting women, not randomly, systematically. The rumors spread slowly at first. Girls vanishing after getting into certain vehicles. Women who never returned from dates. Friends who simply stopped appearing. No phone calls. No sightings. Nothing. At night, sex workers started memorizing license plates themselves because they no longer trusted police to protect them. Some wrote numbers on scraps of paper and tucked them into pockets. Others refused to work alone anymore. Women warned each other about dangerous clients in hushed conversations beneath streetlights. Fear became routine. And the most disturbing part? Authorities still publicly resisted the idea that a serial killer existed. Families filed missing persons reports over and over again. Mothers called precincts begging for updates. Sisters taped photographs to poles and storefront windows. Advocates organized marches demanding investigations. The response they often received was chillingly dismissive. Maybe the women had overdosed somewhere. Maybe they moved cities. Maybe they just didn't want to be found. No bodies. No crime. That phrase echoed through Vancouver, while women continued disappearing one by one. And every disappearance deepened the terror, already spreading to the downtown Eastside. Because these weren't statistics. They were real women with unfinished lives. Serena Botsway had a laugh friends remembered instantly. Loud, sharp, infectious. She struggled with addiction for years. But people close to her said she still protected younger girls on the streets like an older sister. If someone looked scared or lost, Serena noticed. She had a daughter. She talked constantly about getting clean, about starting over. One evening in 2001, Serena told friends she was going to make quick money and would return later that night. Nobody realized those would become her final hours. Georgina Papine stayed close with her family, even during the darkest periods of her addiction. She called home regularly, sometimes just to hear familiar voices. Her sister Cynthia never stopped searching for her after she vanished, never stopped pushing police, never stopped demanding somebody care. Then there was Marn Fry, 24 years old, quiet, artistic, gentle. Friends said she trusted people too easily. She wrote poetry in notebooks and filled margins with little sketches and drawings. Even while battling heroin addiction, pieces of softness still survived inside her. In August of 1997, Mar met a man who didn't seem threatening at all. He was awkward, dirty, socially strange, but harmless. At least that's how he appeared. The man offered to buy her drugs, maybe food, maybe money, and most importantly, he offered escape from the streets for a little while. The women called him Willie, a pig farmer from Port Coquitlam. He had parties on his property sometimes. Lots of people knew him. He handed out cash, bought drinks, let people stay over. Compared to Violent John's prowling East Hastings, Willie Pickton didn't radiate danger. He looked pathetic, almost childlike. That may have been the most dangerous thing about him, because monsters who look like monsters rarely survive very long. The truly terrifying ones learn how to disappear inside ordinary faces. Marn accepted the ride. 16 miles away from Vancouver, beyond the noise of the city and the glow of downtown lights, the road slowly narrowed toward farmland, toward isolation, toward a property littered with rusted machinery, abandoned vehicles, rotting garbage, and the stench of livestock drifting through the air. A place neighbors avoided. A place police would later describe as a nightmare. At the time, nobody knew Marn Fry was driving toward a slaughterhouse. And while women vanished from Vancouver streets, a man living 16 miles away was quietly building the perfect place to make bodies disappear. People later tried to explain Robert Pickton the same way they explained storms. As if evil simply appears one day without warning. As if monsters are born fully formed. But long before investigators uncovered human remains scattered across that pig farm, there were signs. Tiny fractures in the psychology of a boy raised in isolation, humiliation, and blood. Not excuses. Warnings. The Pickton farm sat in Port Coquitlam, surrounded by mud, machinery, and the smell of decay that permanently soaked into clothing and skin. Visitors described the property as filthy even by farm standards. Rotting garbage piled beside rusted equipment. Animal waste coated the ground. Sick pigs wandered through collapsing pens. And inside that environment lived a boy almost completely disconnected from normal human affection. Robert William Pickton was born in 1949, the middle child of Leonard and Louise Pickton. His parents ran the pig farm like a brutal survival operation. And by nearly every account, the animals received more care than the children, especially from his mother. Louise Pickton ruled the property with cold efficiency. The pigs needed feeding. The pigs needed cleaning. The pigs needed attention. The boys came second, sometimes third. Schoolmates remember Robert and his younger brother arriving in clothes stained with manure, smelling so strongly of livestock that children avoided sitting near them. The bullying started early and never stopped. Piggy, stinky, farm freak. The insults followed him through classrooms and school buses and playgrounds until humiliation became routine. Robert rarely fought back. He withdrew instead. Quiet, awkward, emotionally distant. Teachers noticed something else too. He struggled socially in ways that went beyond shyness. He avoided eye contact, spoke strangely, laughed at inappropriate moments. At times, he seemed detached from the emotions of people around him, almost as if human interaction itself confused him. And at home, isolation only deepened. The Pickton children weren't raised with warmth or stability. They were raised with slaughter. Blood became normal before Robert was even old enough to understand death. Animals screaming in pens, carcasses hanging from hooks, organs dumped into barrels. The line between living creature and butchered meat blurred early on that property. Then something happened investigators would later describe as psychologically defining. When Robert was around 12 years old, he used his own money to buy a calf. For the first time in his life, he became emotionally attached to something. Friends were non-existent. Human connection felt impossible. But the calf responded to him. He fed it, cared for it, followed it around the farm. For 2 weeks, that animal became the closest thing Robert Pickton ever had companionship. Then one afternoon, the calf disappeared. He searched the property before finally asking his mother where it had gone. She reportedly told him to check the slaughterhouse. So he walked there alone, and hanging from a meat hook, skinned, gutted, butchered, was a calf. His calf. Investigators and criminal psychologists would later revisit that moment repeatedly because of what it represented psychologically: attachment, betrayal, powerlessness. Love transformed into meat. On that farm, affection was weakness. Life had value only until slaughter became useful. And over time, something inside Robert appeared to harden around that lesson. By 14, he dropped out of school entirely. No graduation, no social life, no identity outside the farm. He eventually found work apprenticing as a butcher, where he developed skills that would later horrify forensic investigators: precision cuts, efficient dismemberment, knowledge of anatomy, methods for processing flesh quickly and systematically. For the first time in his life, Robert Pickton was actually good at something. That mattered. People who fail socially often search desperately for spaces where they feel competent, powerful, respected. For Pickton, that space became slaughterhouses and butcher rooms. Blood no longer disturbed him. If anything, he appeared calmer around it. Years passed. His parents died. Robert and his younger brother David inherited portions of the family property and eventually sold large sections of land to developers for millions. Suddenly, the isolated pig farmer who had spent most of his life rejected by society had money, not sophistication, not social skills, but money. And money changes how people treat you. Robert continued living in a filthy trailer on the farm, surrounded by garbage and animal waste. But now he had something he never possessed growing up: access. People started showing up, especially after the brothers launched something called Piggy's Palace Good Time Society. The name sounded ridiculous, almost cartoonish, which made it easier to underestimate what was happening there. Officially, it operated as a non-profit organization hosting charity events. In reality, Piggy's Palace became a chaotic party hub filled with bikers, drug dealers, sex workers, addicts, drifters, and criminals moving in and out of property at all hours of the night. The old slaughterhouse transformed into a venue packed with loud music, alcohol, drugs, and people too intoxicated to notice how disturbing the environment really was. Neighbors complained constantly. Fights broke out. Gunshots were occasionally reported. Women wandered the property after dark. And through it all, Robert Pickton drifted quietly through crowds, handing out cash, buying drinks, offering drugs, trying desperately to appear generous and harmless. That contradiction became one of the most terrifying aspects of the entire case, because serial predators rarely hunt by appearing dangerous. They hunt by appearing safe. Women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside often described Pickton the same way at first: weird, dirty, socially awkward, but not threatening, not violent, not the kind of man you'd expect to become one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. And yet beneath that soft-spoken awkwardness, investigators now believe something far darker had already begun developing, possibly years earlier. The farm offered isolation. The slaughterhouse offered privacy. The pigs offered disposal. And the women's society ignored offered opportunity. By the late 1990s, rumors around the property had started becoming impossible to ignore completely. Employees noticed women's clothing appearing in strange places. Visitors reported unsettling encounters. Some people claimed they heard screams during parties late at night. Others saw Pickton behaving strangely around women who later disappeared. Still, nobody truly understood what might have already been happening inside those buildings. Or maybe some people did. Maybe they were simply too afraid to look closer, because the most disturbing predators often survive for years behind one simple advantage: disbelief. Nobody wants to believe evil can look ordinary. Nobody wants to believe a socially awkward pig farmer could become a human butcher. Then came the moment investigators would later call the greatest missed opportunity in the entire case. For years, Robert Pickton survived because people underestimated him. He looked too awkward, too dirty, too socially broken to be dangerous. That illusion almost shattered in March of 1997. Almost. And if the system had acted decisively that night, investigators later believe multiple women might still be alive. The woman who came closest to stopping him was named Wendy Lynn Eisteter. And unlike most of the women who entered that farm, Wendy made it back out. Barely. The night began the same way many nights did in Vancouver's downtown Eastside. Cold air, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement, women standing beneath flickering signs trying to survive one more evening. Wendy was working the streets when Robert Pickton approached her. Nothing about him immediately triggered alarm. That's what made him so dangerous. He wasn't charming. He wasn't intimidating. He didn't radiate obvious violence. He looked like a lonely, disheveled farm worker desperate for company. The kind of man most people ignored without a second thought. Pickton offered Wendy money and drove her back to the farm in Port Coquitlam, 16 miles away from downtown Vancouver. The city lights slowly disappeared behind them. Roads narrowed. Buildings faded. Darkness thickened around the vehicle. Then came the farm. Rusting equipment. Mud. The smell of livestock hanging in the cold night air. And somewhere beyond the darkness, the slaughterhouse. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Pickton suddenly snapped a handcuff around Wendy's wrist. The mood changed instantly. No warning. No build-up. 1 second she was sitting beside him. The next she realized she was trapped. Investigators later believe this moment revealed something critical about Pickton's psychology. Control excited him. Not just violence. Domination. The transformation from awkward outcast to absolute authority over another human being. Wendy immediately resisted. That may have saved her life, because what happened next exploded into chaos. Pickton pulled a knife. Wendy fought back. The trailer erupted into violence so sudden and brutal that investigators later struggled to reconstruct every detail. Furniture overturned. Blood splattered walls. The confined space became a frenzy of panic, screaming, and survival instinct. At some point during the struggle, Wendy managed to grab the knife herself, and then both of them started stabbing. Again and again, Pickton slashed at her body, while Wendy fought desperately to stay conscious. Blood poured onto the floor. Her lungs burned. Every second became pure survival. This wasn't a calculated escape. It was animal instinct. One living creature refusing to die. Then somehow impossibly, Wendy broke free, still handcuffed, bleeding heavily. Terrified, she stumbled outside into the darkness and ran toward the road. Investigators later said the scene resembled something from a horror film. A wounded woman fleeing a pig farm in the middle of the night with metal cuffs still attached to her wrist. And then came the detail that still enrages investigators to this day. A passing driver actually stopped. Wendy flagged the vehicle down and begged for help. She survived. Robert Pickton survived too. Both were transported separately to Eagle Ridge Hospital for treatment. And inside that hospital, police were handed the opportunity that could have ended everything years earlier. An orderly searching Pickton's clothing discovered a small key inside his pocket. The key fit the handcuff still locked around Wendy's wrist. It was devastating evidence. Direct, physical, undeniable. Wendy had stab wounds across her body. Pickton had injuries from the struggle. The cuffs connected them. The key connected him to the attack. Authorities arrested Pickton and charged him with attempted murder, assault with a weapon, and forcible confinement. For a brief moment, it looked like the nightmare might finally end before it truly began. Then detectives interviewed Robert Pickton, and the footage unsettled investigators for reasons beyond the violence itself. He didn't behave like someone horrified by what had happened. He sounded detached, calm, almost irritated. At times he rambled strangely, speaking in fragmented explanations that barely made sense. He admitted stabbing Wendy, yet his emotional tone remained bizarrely flat, as if discussing an inconvenience rather than attempted murder. That emotional emptiness would later become one of the most chilling recurring patterns in his behavior. No panic, no guilt, no visible empathy, only self-preservation. And still, prosecutors had a strong case, or at least they should have, because beneath the surface, another contradiction was already poisoning the investigation. Wendy was a sex worker struggling with addiction, and in the eyes of the justice system at the time, that made her unreliable, dangerously unreliable. The defense targeted her credibility immediately. Questions about drugs, mental stability, lifestyle, memory. Suddenly, the focus drifted away from the man accused of handcuffing and stabbing her, and shifted toward whether Wendy herself could be trusted. It was a pattern families of missing women knew all too well. Victims from the downtown Eastside were often treated as disposable long before they vanished. The charges against Pickton slowly weakened. Then they collapsed entirely. In January of 1998, prosecutors stayed the charges. Robert Pickton walked free. No prison sentence. No major investigation into his background. No aggressive scrutiny of the farm. Nothing. Just another violent incident pushed aside inside a system already overwhelmed with prejudice, bureaucracy, and indifference toward vulnerable women. And the most horrifying part? Evidence from the attack still existed. The bloody clothes, the rubber boots, items stained from the struggle between Wendy and Pickton. Police placed them into storage lockers, then forgot about them. Years later, after investigators finally uncovered the full scale of Pickton's crimes, forensic testing revealed something chilling. DNA from murder victims was found on those boots, meaning there's a terrifying possibility investigators still struggle to confront. By the time Wendy escaped that farm, Robert Pickton may already have been killing women, and if the evidence had been properly tested in 1997, if authorities had treated Wendy like a credible victim, if someone had looked closer at the pig farm, then how many lives could have been saved? 10? 15? More? That question still haunts the case because after Wendy survived, nothing truly changed. Pickton returned to farm. The parties continued. The slaughterhouse remained untouched. And women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside kept disappearing into darkness one after another. While police filed the evidence away, women kept disappearing. By the late 1990s, the Pickton farm had developed a reputation, not just as a filthy property, not just as a party destination for bikers and addicts, something darker. People felt it when they stepped onto the land, an uneasiness that settled into the stomach almost immediately. The smell hit first. Rotting garbage, animal blood, stagnant water, pig waste baking into the mud. Then came the silence. Not normal countryside silence. A dead silence. The kind that makes people instinctively lower their voices. And yet despite the atmosphere, people kept coming. Because Robert Pickton understood something predators throughout history have always understood. Desperate people are easier to control, especially when you become useful to them. The farm became a chaotic ecosystem of dependency. Drugs circulated constantly. Women needing a place to sleep could stay there temporarily. People short on cash suddenly found Pickton offering money, food, alcohol, or drugs with no immediate demands attached. At first, that was how he built trust. Not through charm, through access. He made vulnerable people feel temporarily safe around him long enough for their instincts to quiet down. And inside that chaos, disturbing details kept surfacing around the property, like pieces of a nightmare struggling to reveal itself. One former employee later described entering Pickton's trailer and noticing piles of women's belongings scattered around inside. Purses, identification cards, jewelry, clothing. At first glance, it almost looked like forgotten property left behind after parties. Until you realize something terrifying. The women attached to those belongings weren't returning for them. Another witness described seeing inhalers, makeup kits, and personal items stacked in strange places throughout the farm buildings. Tiny remnants of lives reduced to abandoned objects. It should have raised immediate alarms. Instead, many people rationalized what they saw because denial felt safer than confronting the alternative. The alternative was monstrous. Then the rumors escalated. One tipster reportedly contacted authorities claiming human flesh was stored inside a freezer on the property. Human flesh. Not rumor. Not vague suspicion. A direct allegation. Police still failed to aggressively pursue the farm. And the longer authorities hesitated, the more terrifying witness accounts became. One woman in particular would later deliver testimony, so disturbing investigators never forgot it. Her name was Lynn Ellingson. Lynn spent time on the farm and knew Pickton personally. Like many others orbiting the property, addiction and instability made survival itself difficult enough without inviting danger from violent men connected to biker culture and criminal networks. Fear controlled everything there. Fear of losing access to drugs. Fear of retaliation. Fear of disappearing yourself. One night, Lynn entered the slaughterhouse. What she saw inside would haunt the investigation forever. A woman's body, hanging from a hook, cut open, blood everywhere. At first, her mind struggled to process the image because it looked too horrifying to be real. The body had been suspended exactly like butchered livestock inside the same building where pigs were slaughtered. Then Lynn noticed something that made the scene undeniably human. Painted toenails, bright against the blood. That detail shattered any possibility of denial. Investigators later believed the victim may have still been alive moments earlier. And according to Lynn's account, Robert Pickton was standing nearby, calmly dismembering the body as if performing routine farm work. The sheer psychological horror of that image is difficult to comprehend. A serial killer operating openly enough that witnesses could literally walk into a slaughterhouse and encounter human remains. And still, nobody stopped him. Not because nobody cared, because terror had infected the environment around him. People connected to the farm often existed on the edges of society, where survival depended on silence. Many feared police almost as much as criminals. Others believed reporting Pickton would get them killed. Some likely convinced themselves they hadn't truly seen what they thought they saw. Human beings are remarkably skilled at rejecting unbearable truths, especially when accepting those truths could destroy your entire sense of safety. And Robert Pickton exploited that psychology constantly. At Piggy's palace parties, chaos became camouflage. Hundreds of people cycled through the property over time. Hell's Angels associates reportedly attended events. Drugs moved freely. Music blasted through the night, while intoxicated guests wandered between trailers, barns, and slaughter areas. Perfect confusion. Perfect noise. Perfect cover. Women disappeared into that environment without immediate alarm because disappearance itself was already common in the downtown Eastside. That's what made the case so horrifying. The killer didn't need elaborate schemes. Society had already built the ideal hunting ground for him. Even when investigators started suspecting Pickton more seriously, frustration crippled the process. Multiple police departments handled different missing persons cases with poor communication between agencies. Warrants were delayed. Evidence thresholds became bureaucratic obstacles. At times, detectives came painfully close to the truth. Then momentum collapsed again. One investigator later admitted authorities essentially faced a terrifying contradiction. Too many disappearances pointed toward a serial predator. Yet the victims themselves came from a population the system consistently failed to prioritize. That contradiction created paralysis. And while institutions hesitated, women continued vanishing, one after another. The timeline grew more disturbing with every passing year. Friends noticed entire circles of women disappearing from East Hastings. Memorial marches expanded annually. Families demanded answers louder and louder. Still the farm remained operational. Still the slaughterhouse stood untouched. Still Robert Pickton moved freely through Vancouver, pretending to be a harmless, eccentric farmer, while witnesses carried unimaginable secrets in silence. And perhaps the most terrifying question investigators faced later was this: how many people truly suspected something horrific was happening there? Not necessarily murder, but something deeply wrong. Because by the early 2000s, the rumors surrounding Pickton had become impossible to completely ignore. Stories spread through the downtown Eastside warning women about the farm. Some avoided him entirely. Others had no choice. Addiction destroys the luxury of caution. Then finally, after years of near misses, failed warnings, ignored witnesses, and mounting disappearances, investigators received information they could legally act on without relying on vulnerable testimony. Not murder, not missing women, guns. And that single detail would crack open the gates to one of the most horrifying crime scenes in modern history. The search warrant looked almost routine. Illegal firearms. That was the official reason investigators arrived at the Pickton farm on February 5, 2002. Not missing women. Not homicide. Not the dozens of families still begging for answers across Vancouver. After years of rumors, failed investigations, ignored witnesses, and disappearing women, the breakthrough finally came because of guns. And nobody walking onto that property that morning understood they were about to enter one of the most horrifying crime scenes in modern history. Rain soaked the farmland as officers moved through the maze of rusted vehicles, muddy pathways, collapsing buildings, and scattered machinery covering the property. The farm looked abandoned in places. Rotten debris sat piled beside animal pens. The smell of manure and decay hung thick in the cold air. Then investigators entered the trailer. At first, the search appeared ordinary. Firearms, a few suspicious items, clutter everywhere. But something felt wrong almost immediately. Veteran officers later described an atmosphere inside the buildings that was difficult to explain logically. The property carried a heaviness to it, a suffocating sensation. Rooms packed with filth, stains nobody wanted to identify too quickly. Then came the freezer. An investigator opened it expecting storage meat from the farm. Instead, he found a plastic bucket containing what appeared to be human remains. For a second, nobody spoke. The brain rejects certain images at first, especially when they appear where they shouldn't exist. Then another discovery. A severed head. Female, dark hair still attached. The room went silent. Everything changed instantly. The firearm investigation disappeared on the spot. Now investigators were standing inside what looked like a human slaughterhouse. Within hours, officers sealed the property as a major crime scene. More investigators flooded the farm. Then forensic teams arrived. Then anthropologists. Then excavation crews. And as they began searching deeper into the property, the nightmare expanded beyond anything authorities initially imagined. Inside trailers and farm buildings, investigators uncovered women's purses, identification cards, inhalers, shoes, jewelry, and blood-soaked clothing scattered among piles of garbage and animal remains. Tiny fragments of human lives, frozen in place. A lipstick tube, a pair of earrings, photographs, objects so ordinary they became unbearable once investigators realized many belonged to missing women whose families were still searching for them. The slaughterhouse itself became the center of the horror. Hooks dangled from ceilings. Industrial freezers lined the walls. Blood-stained surfaces throughout the building. At first, investigators struggled to determine what came from pigs and what came from humans. That sentence alone captures how grotesque the farm truly was. Forensic teams began excavating nearly every inch of the property. Heavy machinery tore through mud fields and manure piles while investigators sifted carefully through dirt by hand, searching for bone fragments no larger than coins. The process became nightmarishly slow and emotionally devastating because human remains kept appearing. A jawbone, teeth, ribs, vertebrae, fragments burned beyond recognition. Some remains had been buried, others fed to pigs, others processed through industrial equipment. Investigators soon realized Robert Pickton had not simply murdered women. He had attempted to erase them completely. That revelation transformed the case from serial murder into something almost industrial in scale. Then forensic analysts made another horrifying discovery. DNA evidence existed everywhere. Inside freezers, on tools, on clothing, mixed across surfaces throughout the farm. The contamination was so extreme investigators compared parts of property to biological chaos. Human remains had become intertwined with the daily operation of the farm itself. And then came the possibility that horrified the public more than almost anything else. Investigators learned Pickton may have processed human flesh alongside pork products. Authorities launched urgent investigations into whether contaminated meat may have entered the food supply through farm distribution networks. Suddenly, the terror expanded beyond missing women. Now entire communities feared they had unknowingly consumed evidence of murder. News coverage exploded across Canada, then internationally. Helicopters circled overhead. Satellite trucks lined roads outside the property. Families of missing women watched televised updates in horror as reporters described skull fragments and human remains being excavated from the pig farm they had begged police to investigate years earlier. For some families, hope died in real time through television broadcasts. Others still clung desperately to denial, because until DNA confirmed identities, there remained one final possibility. Maybe their daughter wasn't there. Maybe she escaped somehow. Maybe she was still alive. Then the forensic identifications began. One victim, then another, then another. The list kept growing. Investigators eventually recovered DNA from 33 women connected to the farm. 33. Even seasoned homicide detectives struggled psychologically with the scale of the case. Counseling services were brought in for investigators, processing evidence day after day inside an environment saturated with death. One forensic worker later admitted the smell never truly left them. It followed them home, into sleep, into nightmares. And through all of it, Robert Pickton remained strangely detached, almost passive, as if the discovery unfolding around him still wasn't emotionally real to him. That emotional vacancy deeply unsettled investigators, because serial killers often display panic once exposed. Pickton frequently appeared more annoyed than frightened. And the deeper investigators dug into the farm, the more terrifying one question became. How long had this been happening? Years? Decades? Some evidence suggested the killings stretched far further back than authorities initially believed. Missing women from different timelines, backgrounds, and locations began resurfacing through forensic databases tied to property. The scale of the operation overwhelmed law enforcement. At one point, the investigation became the largest and most expensive serial killer case in Canadian history. Still, investigators feared something even worse. What if the farm did not contain all the victims? What if other bodies had already been completely destroyed? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what if Robert Pickton wasn't acting entirely alone? Rumors spread rapidly through the media frenzy surrounding the investigation. Witnesses described strange men at the farm. Biker connections resurfaced. Stories emerged about parties where women vanished after entering certain buildings. The public became obsessed with one terrifying possibility. A serial killer had operated openly for years inside a property surrounded by witnesses, visitors, criminals, and rumors. So how could nobody stop him? Then investigators uncovered something even more chilling than the crime scene itself. Because the most horrifying discovery in the entire case wasn't found buried on the farm. It came directly from Robert Pickton's own mouth. By the time Robert Pickton sat inside his jail cell waiting trial, investigators already believed they were dealing with one of the most prolific serial killers in North American history. But they still didn't know how many women were actually dead, and they still didn't fully understand the man at the center of it all. Because even after the farm excavation uncovered human remains, DNA evidence, personal belongings, and body fragments scattered across the property, Robert Pickton himself remained emotionally unreadable. No visible grief, no panic, no horror at what investigators were discovering. Just that same detached emptiness witnesses had described for years. It unsettled everyone around him. Then authorities launched an undercover operation designed to crack him psychologically from the inside. And what happened next would horrify the entire country. Investigators placed Pickton in a jail environment with an undercover officer posing as a fellow inmate. The operation relied on a simple psychological principle that has trapped countless killers before. Ego eventually outweighs caution, especially in predators who secretly crave recognition. At first, Pickton stayed guarded, quiet, suspicious, but over time, he relaxed around the undercover operative, believing he was speaking to another criminal instead of law enforcement. The conversations became casual, almost mundane. That's what made the recording so disturbing. Not rage, not madness, normality. One of the most terrifying aspects of Robert Pickton was how ordinary he sounded while discussing unimaginable violence. There was no cinematic villain performance, no explosive confession, just a soft-spoken man casually describing murder like farm maintenance. And then came the sentence that would become permanently attached to his name. A sentence so cold it still sends chills through investigators decades later. Pickton admitted he wanted to kill 50 women. He said he had been sloppy. And then he laughed lightly before saying he was upset because he only got 49. One more, he said. One more. And I would have made it 50. The undercover officer later described a moment as surreal because Pickton didn't deliver the statement with pride exactly, or guilt, or even excitement. He spoke about mass murder with the emotional weight of someone discussing unfinished chores. That emotional emptiness terrified investigators more than rage ever could, because rage can explode. Rage can lose control. What they heard in those recordings was something colder, methodical, emotionally vacant. A man who viewed human beings as disposable material. And as Pickton continued talking, the true horror of the farm began revealing itself piece by piece. He described targeting vulnerable women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside because they were easier to isolate and less likely to trigger immediate investigations. Many struggled with addiction. Many lacked stable support systems. Some had already disappeared temporarily before returning. Society had trained itself not to notice them quickly. Pickton understood that and exploited it. According to the recordings, he often lured women back to the farm with promises of money, drugs, shelter, or companionship. Sometimes he presented himself almost like a helpful friend. That deception became central to his hunting pattern. Women entered the property voluntarily, which meant for a brief period they likely felt safe. That may be the cruelest part psychologically. The killer wasn't simply overpowering strangers. He was weaponizing trust. Then Pickton described the murders themselves. The details varied, but investigators believed many victims were handcuffed before being attacked. Some accounts involved stabbing. Others involved strangulation. In certain conversations, Pickton referenced shooting victims. The methods changed. The outcome didn't. And after the killings came the process investigators struggled most to comprehend emotionally. Dismemberment, systematic, practical, cold. Pickton discussed butchering bodies with the same technical familiarity he once used processing livestock. Years spent inside slaughterhouses had erased psychological barriers most people cannot even imagine crossing. Human flesh became procedural to him, something to cut apart, dispose of, erase. Investigators later believed he fed remains to pigs because pigs consume almost anything. Bones, flesh, organs. Evidence disappeared quickly once inside those pens. The farm itself became part of the killing process. The animals, the machinery, the slaughterhouse drains. Every inch of the property functioned like a mechanism designed to dissolve human existence. And even then, Pickton apparently kept thinking bigger. During conversations with the undercover operative, he discussed fantasies about disposing of bodies in the ocean, weighted remains, dump sites, methods to avoid future detection. That detail deeply disturbed investigators because it suggested something horrifying. The murders may not have stopped naturally. The investigation stopped him. If authorities had not raided the farm in 2002, how much longer would the killings have continued? 5 more victims? 10? 50 more? No one can answer that. And as portions of the undercover tapes became public, outrage exploded across Canada. Families of victims were forced to hear the casual tone of a man discussing murdered daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends as if they were inventory. The emotional devastation became almost impossible to measure, especially because many families already believed the system had failed long before Pickton ever confessed. Now they were hearing proof of the scale. Proof authorities may have had opportunities to stop him years earlier. Proof that vulnerable women had effectively been abandoned inside a hunting ground predators understood better than police did. But even with the confessions, another frustration emerged almost immediately. Investigators believed Pickton killed far more women than prosecutors could definitively prove in court. The farm had become too contaminated, too chaotic, too biologically destroyed. Many remains were fragmented beyond identification. Some victims may have been entirely consumed or disposed of. DNA evidence existed without complete bodies attached to it, and that created a legal nightmare. Because morally, psychologically, emotionally, investigators believed they were confronting a killer responsible for dozens upon dozens of murders. Legally, proving each one beyond reasonable doubt became far harder. Families watched this contradiction unfold in agony. The man sitting in that jail cell casually joked about making 50. Yet prosecutors still faced enormous challenges securing convictions that would survive appeals. And beneath all of it lingered another question the public could never fully shake. Could someone really commit crimes this massive completely alone? Rumors about accomplices refused to disappear. Witnesses described suspicious figures at the farm for years. Biker connections lingered around the edges of the investigation. Some families became convinced other people knew more than they ever admitted publicly. Whether those suspicions were true or not, one reality became undeniable. The justice system had already failed these women repeatedly before the confessions ever surfaced. And heartbreakingly, many families were about to feel failed all over again, because then came the trial, and another decision that devastated the victims' families. The courtroom should have felt like the end of the nightmare. After years of disappearances, after families marched through Vancouver carrying photographs of missing daughters, after investigators excavated human remains from beneath a pig farm, justice was finally supposed to arrive. Instead, for many families, the trial reopened the wound all over again. Because the deeper prosecutors moved into the case, the clearer one horrifying reality became. The scale of Robert Pickton's crimes was almost too massive to prosecute cleanly. There were too many victims, too much forensic evidence, too many fragmented remains, too many years of institutional failure already contaminating the investigation. And at the center of it all sat Robert Pickton himself, staring blankly through courtroom proceedings while the country tried to comprehend what he had done. Originally, prosecutors charged Pickton with the murders of 26 women. 26. Even saying the number aloud felt surreal. But trying 26 homicide cases simultaneously would have created one of the most complex criminal proceedings in Canadian history. The evidence alone filled entire rooms. Investigators had recovered hundreds of thousands of exhibits from the farm. DNA evidence intertwined victims together across buildings, freezers, tools, clothing, and machinery. The farm itself had become a forensic labyrinth. So prosecutors made a controversial decision. They split the charges. 6 murder cases would go to trial first. The remaining 20 would wait. To many families, the strategy felt painfully practical. To others, it already felt like compromise. Because every delayed charge represented another woman whose story risked being pushed aside yet again. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence unlike anything most jurors had ever encountered. Human remains connected to the farm, DNA evidence linking victims directly to Pickton's property, personal belongings recovered from trailers and slaughter areas, and then came the undercover confession tapes. The jury heard Pickton casually discussing murder, calmly, emotionlessly, as if he were describing routine chores around the farm. At times, the courtroom reportedly fell silent listening to recordings because the tone itself became horrifying. There was no dramatic rage in his voice, no cinematic insanity, just emptiness. A human being discussing destroyed lives with chilling detachment. Families of victims sat through those recordings carrying unbearable emotional weight. Mothers heard the man accused of murdering their daughters joke about numbers. One more for 50. As if human lives existed only as milestones inside his private fantasy. Some relatives cried openly inside the courtroom. Others stared forward in complete numbness. And still, despite the overwhelming horror surrounding the case, the defense attacked relentlessly. Their strategy focused heavily on uncertainty. The farm had contamination everywhere. DNA had spread across buildings and machinery. Multiple people visited the property over the years. The defense suggested alternative possibilities. Could others have been responsible for some deaths? Could evidence have transferred accidentally? Could forensic interpretations be overstated? For families already exhausted by years of institutional failure, hearing those arguments felt almost unbearable. Because after everything uncovered at the farm, after the remains, the confessions, the freezer, the blood-soaked evidence, the possibility of ambiguity still lingered inside the legal system. And that distinction matters enormously in criminal court. Public certainty and legal certainty are not the same thing. Then came another emotional blow. When the verdict finally arrived in December 2007, the jury convicted Robert Pickton of 6 counts of second-degree murder. Not first degree, second degree. The difference devastated many families instantly. Second-degree murder still carried life sentences in Canada. But psychologically, emotionally, the ruling felt incomplete to some loved ones. First-degree murder would have legally acknowledged planning and deliberation. Second degree suggested something less calculated, less intentional. For families who believe Pickton systematically hunted vulnerable women for years, the distinction felt deeply painful, especially after hearing the confession tapes, especially after everything found on the farm. Some relatives described feeling emotionally hollow after the verdict instead of relieved, because even inside conviction, there remained a terrible sense that the full truth had never truly been spoken aloud in court. And then came the decision that intensified that pain even further. In 2010, prosecutors officially stayed the remaining 20 murder charges. No additional trials. No additional convictions. Legally, authorities argued there was little practical benefit continuing, because Pickton already faced the maximum sentence available under Canadian law. Emotionally, however, the impact on families was devastating. 20 women would never receive individual murder verdicts attached to their names. 20 stories left suspended inside legal limbo. For some relatives, it felt like another abandonment, another institutional calculation, outweighing emotional justice. The reaction fractured public opinion across Canada. Some believe prosecutors made the only realistic choice after such an enormous and expensive investigation. Others believe the system had failed the victims one final time. Because the truth is uncomfortable. The legal system often prioritizes efficiency once conviction becomes guaranteed. Families prioritize acknowledgement, closure, recognition that each life mattered individually. And in the Pickton case, those two realities collided painfully. Outside the courthouse, relatives carried photographs of women whose cases would never fully reach trial. Some spoke publicly through tears about daughters reduced to statistics. Others expressed fury toward police, prosecutors, and institutions they believed ignored warning for years before finally uncovering the horror. One question echoed louder than all the others. How could this many women disappear before society truly cared? That question transformed the Pickton case into something larger than serial murder, because by the end of the trial, the public understood a terrifying reality. Robert Pickton did not operate in isolation from societal failure. He operated inside it. The downtown Eastside had become the perfect hunting ground precisely because vulnerable women were already being ignored long before they vanished. And once investigators began examining the full timeline of disappearances, missed warnings, dismissed witnesses, failed coordination between police departments, and systemic neglect toward Indigenous women and sex workers, the case stopped being only about one killer. It became about an entire system that allowed him to survive for years, because the investigation uncovered something even bigger than one serial killer. Once the trial ended, many people expected closure. A monster had been captured. Bodies had been found. Convictions had been secured. The nightmare was over, except the deeper investigators examined the timeline surrounding Robert Pickton. The more disturbing the case became, because eventually, the central question stopped being, how did one man kill so many women? And became, how did every warning system fail around him for so long? That question ignited national outrage across Canada, not only toward Robert Pickton himself, toward police, toward government agencies, toward institutions that families had begged for help years before the farm was ever raided. And once those failures were pulled into the light, the case transformed from serial murder into something far larger, a reckoning. For years before Pickton's arrest, women vanished across Vancouver's downtown Eastside with alarming consistency. Families filed missing persons reports repeatedly. Advocates warned authorities that a serial predator was likely operating in the area. Women on the streets warned each other too. Everyone closest to the danger seemed to recognize the pattern. Everyone except the institutions responsible for stopping it. Part of the problem came from fragmentation inside law enforcement itself. Multiple police agencies handled different jurisdictions surrounding Vancouver. The Vancouver Police Department managed disappearances inside the city. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police handled surrounding areas, including Port Coquitlam where the Pickton farm sat. Information moved slowly, sometimes poorly. Critical intelligence scattered across departments instead of converging into a unified investigation. One agency might view a disappearance as isolated, while another noticed a growing pattern elsewhere. And predators thrive inside fragmentation, especially organized predators. Investigators later uncovered repeated communication breakdowns between departments that delayed urgency surrounding the missing women cases. Potential leads stalled inside bureaucracy. Competing theories slowed momentum. Officers disagreed over whether a serial killer even existed. While police debated, women kept disappearing. Then came the harder truth, the one many officials initially resisted discussing publicly. Institutional prejudice shaped the investigation from the very beginning. Most of the missing women came from vulnerable backgrounds. Many struggled with addiction. Many were sex workers. Many were indigenous. And those realities dramatically affected how urgently their disappearances were treated. Families recognized it immediately. If dozens of middle-class women from wealthy neighborhoods vanished, public panic would have exploded within weeks. Resources would have flooded investigations instantly. Media coverage would have dominated national headlines. That didn't happen in the downtown Eastside, because society had already labeled many of those women as disposable long before they vanished. That realization devastated the country once the full scope of the case emerged, especially for indigenous communities. A staggering number of Pickton suspected victims were indigenous women, reflecting a much broader national crisis already unfolding across Canada for decades. Indigenous women face disproportionately high rates of violence, disappearance, addiction, homelessness, and systemic neglect. The Pickton investigation became a horrifying symbol of that larger reality. Families testified publicly about feeling ignored when reporting loved ones missing. Some described police dismissing concerns almost immediately, assuming women were partying, using drugs, or choosing to disappear voluntarily. Imagine hearing that while searching desperately for your daughter. Imagine knowing she was likely already dead. That emotional devastation eventually led to one of the most significant public inquiries in Canadian history, the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry. Its purpose was brutal in its simplicity. Figure out how this happened and who failed. The findings became explosive. The final report carried a title that perfectly captured the emotional reality families had lived through for years. Forsaken. Forsaken by institutions. Forsaken by policing failures. Forsaken by prejudice. Forsaken by a society that looked away from vulnerable women until a serial killer forced the country to confront what had been ignored. The report outlined devastating conclusions. Investigators found blatant failures in police coordination. Authorities had underestimated the danger for years despite mounting disappearances. Critical warnings from community advocates and families were repeatedly overlooked. Even more painful, many recommendations capable of improving the investigation earlier had already been proposed long before the farm raid ever happened. The system knew vulnerabilities existed. The system simply failed to respond fast enough. Public anger exploded again after the report became public. Not just because Robert Pickton murdered women, because institutions helped create the conditions where he could continue. And perhaps the most haunting part of all, many families still believed full accountability never truly arrived. Some officers faced criticism. Departments promised reforms. Policies changed. Task forces improved coordination for future investigations involving missing vulnerable persons. New procedures emerged around data sharing and risk assessment. But for relatives who lost daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends, reforms could never erase the years already stolen, or the possibility that lives could have been saved if authorities acted sooner. That emotional wound remains open even today, especially among Indigenous communities, still confronting ongoing violence against women across Canada. The Pickton case forced the country to acknowledge something deeply uncomfortable. Serial killers do not hunt in a vacuum. They hunt where systems weaken, where people stop looking closely, where vulnerability accumulates faster than protection. And once the public truly absorbed that reality, another terrifying question emerged naturally afterward. Could this happen again? The answer frightened people because nobody could confidently say no. Not completely. Even after reforms, concerns persisted surrounding missing persons investigations, institutional bias, and failures involving marginalized communities. Families and activists continued warning that vulnerable women still disappear without sufficient urgency. Some investigators privately feared something even darker. If Robert Pickton operated for years while rumors, witnesses, and disappearances surrounded him constantly, how many other predators have escaped detection entirely? That question lingers over the case like a shadow, because history repeatedly shows the same terrifying pattern. Monsters survive longest where victims are least protected. And perhaps that is the most disturbing legacy Robert Pickton left behind. Not simply the horror of the murders themselves, but the realization that society helped create the silence around them. A silence family spent years screaming against before anyone finally listened. Then, decades after the farm raid shocked the world, Robert Pickton's story ended in a way nobody expected. The fluorescent lights inside the prison never felt like daylight. They hummed with a constant, sickly buzz, as if the building itself was always thinking, always remembering what it contained. Robert Pickton had been moved again. Another transfer, another cell, another attempt to contain something that, to many, should never have been allowed to exist in the first place. The system had already done what it always does with men like him, shuffled him deeper into concrete and steel, as though distance could dilute what he had done. But inside prisons, stories travel faster than paperwork, and names like his don't disappear. There are men who become legends behind bars, not the kind written about in newspapers, but whispered in corridors where the lights don't reach properly. Pickton was one of them, a man whose crimes outside had followed him inside like a shadow that refused to be locked away. On a day that would later be described in dry official language as an incident, the routine of prison life continued uninterrupted. Doors clanged, guards counted. Time moved forward in its indifferent rhythm, until it didn't. It happened quickly, not dramatically, not like the movies. There was no warning siren, no cinematic buildup, just a sudden convergence of proximity and intent. Another inmate, a makeshift weapon, nothing sophisticated, nothing theatrical. Prison violence rarely is. It's improvised, crude, and final in its purpose. By the time guards responded, the damage had already been done. Pickton was left with severe brain trauma, the kind that doesn't just injure the body, but erases parts of what a person is in real time. Consciousness fractured, vital functions collapsing into silence and alarm. The man once responsible for unimaginable brutality was now reduced to a medical emergency on cold institutional floors. He was rushed for treatment. Machines took over where the body failed. And for a short, uncertain stretch of time, he existed in that liminal space between life and something close to its end. Days later, the announcement came. Robert Pickton had died in custody. No courtroom, no final confession, no last confrontation with the families of those who had spent decades trying to make the world listen. Just a statement, just an ending filed away in administrative language. But outside those walls, the reaction was anything but simple. For some families, there was relief so quiet it barely had a name. Not joy, not closure, just the release of holding a breath they had been unknowingly suffocating on for years. A weight, finally gone, but leaving behind a hollow space that nothing could fill. For others, it was anger that had nowhere left to go, because justice for them had never truly arrived. The trial had come too late. The warnings had come too early and been ignored. The system had looked away too many times, and now even punishment had arrived in a form they could not question in court. And for many, there was only emptiness, the kind that doesn't resolve itself with time, because time was part of what failed in the first place. In the days that followed, people returned to the names of the women, not the headlines, not the perpetrator, the victims, the ones whose lives had been reduced for years to statistics and reports and fragments in investigations that came too late. A memorial walk was held, quiet footsteps moving through streets that had once been part of their everyday lives. Photographs carried carefully, as if even a wind might try to take them away. Candles flickering in daylight that felt too normal for what it represented. Each name spoken aloud carried a different kind of weight, not just remembrance, but accusation, against neglect, against delay, against every moment the system had chosen not to see. Because in the end, this case was never only about one man. It was about how many opportunities there were to stop him, how many warnings were dismissed, How many disappearances were not connected? How many lives were allowed to slip through cracks that were never repaired? Robert Pickton died in prison. But the real horror of this case was never just one man. It was how many chances the world had to stop him and chose not to